February 23, 2022, 11:47 p.m. Moscow time. In the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin sat alone in his private study, surrounded by maps, military briefings, and the weight of a decision that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe. In less than 12 hours, Russian forces would begin what Putin had convinced himself was a necessary military operation to protect Russian interests and restore historical justice. But in that quiet moment before dawn, something unexpected happened. Putin picked up his secure phone and placed a call to someone who had no official government position, no military rank, and no formal diplomatic role. He called Alain Delon, the 86-year-old French film star who had become, over the decades, an unlikely cultural bridge between East and West. The relationship between Putin and Alain was one of mutual respect that had developed over many years of occasional meetings and conversations. Putin, despite his reputation for cold calculation, had always been fascinated by European culture and art. Alain represented something that Putin both admired and perhaps envied: the ability to influence hearts and minds through beauty and artistry rather than through power and intimidation. Their previous conversations had covered topics ranging from cinema to history, from philosophy to the nature of leadership. Putin seemed to value Alain's perspective precisely because it came from outside the world of politics and military strategy. In Alain, Putin found someone who could speak to him not as a head of state, but as a human being grappling with complex moral questions. That night in February, Putin was calling for what he claimed would be the last time before undertaking an action that he knew would change everything. The official justification for the military operation had been carefully constructed: protecting Russian-speaking populations, preventing NATO expansion, correcting historical injustices. But in the privacy of his study, Putin seemed to be seeking something different: validation from someone whose opinion he respected, despite knowing that validation would likely not come. When Alain answered the phone at his home in Switzerland, he was immediately struck by something different in Putin's voice. After decades in the entertainment industry, Alain had developed an acute sensitivity to emotional undertones, and what he heard was not the confident voice of a leader executing a carefully planned strategy, but something more complex and troubled. "Alain," Putin said in French, a language he had studied specifically to communicate with the actor, "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow. There are actions I must take, decisions that cannot be avoided. I hoped you might understand the historical necessity of what is about to occur." The conversation that followed lasted 23 minutes and covered topics ranging from historical precedents to moral philosophy, from the nature of leadership to the price of power. But it was Alain's response to Putin's justifications that created the moment of silence that would briefly pause the march toward war.
Alain listened carefully as Putin explained his reasoning: the expansion of NATO, the treatment of Russian speakers in Ukraine, the historical claims that Russia had on Ukrainian territory. The arguments were familiar ones, rehearsed and refined through months of preparation. Putin spoke with the confidence of a man who had convinced himself that his actions were not only justified but morally necessary. When Putin finished his explanation, there was a brief pause before Alain responded. What he said next was delivered in the calm, measured tone that had made him one of cinema's most compelling voices, but the words carried a moral weight that caught Putin completely off guard. "Vladimir," Alain said, using the Russian leader's first name in a way that immediately shifted the dynamic of the conversation, "I have lived through enough history to recognize the difference between necessity and desire, between justice and vengeance, between strength and brutality. What you are describing to me is not the action of a great leader protecting his people. It is the action of a man who has confused his personal legacy with his nation's welfare. The directness of the statement was shocking, but Alain continued before Putin could respond. You speak of historical necessity, but every tyrant in history has used the same justification. You speak of protecting Russian speakers, but you are about to make them refugees in their own land. You speak of preventing NATO expansion, but you are about to drive every European nation directly into NATO's arms. Putin attempted to interject, to restate his position, but Alain's next words stopped him completely. I have known you for many years, Vladimir. I have seen you when you are not performing for cameras or generals. I know you understand the difference between right and wrong, between building something beautiful and destroying it. What you are planning is not strength. It is the confession of a leader who has run out of ideas. The silence that followed was profound. For 10 minutes and 15 seconds, according to the phone records that would later be discovered, Putin said nothing. The line remained open, but the man who had spent months convincing himself and his advisors that military action was inevitable found himself confronted by a moral clarity that cut through all the justifications and strategic reasoning. During those 10 minutes, Alain could hear Putin breathing, could sense the internal struggle taking place on the other end of the line. This was not a political leader being challenged by another politician, or a military commander being questioned by a rival. This was a human being being forced to confront the moral implications of his actions by someone whose opinion he genuinely valued. When Putin finally spoke again, his voice had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like confusion. But the strategic situation, the security concerns, the historical precedents. History will not remember your strategic concerns, Alain replied, gently but firmly. It will remember whether you chose to build or to destroy, whether you used your power to protect the innocent or to satisfy your own ambitions. You have the opportunity to be remembered as a great leader who chose peace over conquest, but that window is closing.
Alain continued with words that would resonate with Putin long after the conversation ended. You admire Russian culture, Russian art, Russian literature. But the greatest works of Russian art were created by people who understood that true power lies in creating beauty, not in destroying it. Tolstoy wrote about war, but his message was about the futility of violence. Tchaikovsky composed music that moved hearts without breaking them. You have the power to create something beautiful for Russia's future. Why are you choosing to create something ugly? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Putin seemed genuinely uncertain about how to respond. Those who worked closely with him would later note that this was perhaps the only time in years when Putin appeared to be genuinely reconsidering a major decision. But the moment of moral reflection was brief. The momentum of months of military preparation, the expectations of advisors who had invested their reputations in the operation, and Putin's own psychological investment in the narrative of historical correction proved too strong to overcome. I appreciate your perspective, Alain, Putin said finally, his voice returning to something approaching its normal tone. But there are realities that artists and actors cannot fully understand. Sometimes leaders must make choices that others will not appreciate until history proves them correct.
Alain's final words to Putin were spoken with the sadness of someone who had failed to prevent a tragedy he could see coming. Then I pray that history is more forgiving than the millions of people whose lives you are about to destroy. And I pray that when you wake up tomorrow morning, you remember this conversation and ask yourself whether the price you are paying is worth what you hope to gain. The call ended at 12:10 a.m. Moscow time. 7 hours and 20 minutes later, the first Russian missiles began striking targets across Ukraine. In the days and weeks that followed, as the world watched the invasion unfold with all its tragic consequences, very few people knew about the conversation that had taken place in those final hours before the war began. Alain never spoke publicly about the call, honoring what he considered a private conversation between two human beings, regardless of their public roles. But those close to Alain noted that the war affected him profoundly. He had been given a rare opportunity to potentially influence the course of history, and despite his most passionate arguments, he had failed to prevent what he saw as an unnecessary tragedy. The weight of that failure troubled him for the remaining months of his life. When Alain died in August 2024, among his personal effects was found a handwritten note dated February 24, 2022, just hours after his conversation with Putin. The note, written in his careful script, read simply, "I spoke to a man who could have chosen to be remembered as a peacemaker, but chose instead to be remembered as a conqueror. History will judge us both for what happened next." The existence of the call was only confirmed after Alain's death, when his estate released selected portions of his private journals. Even then, the full transcript of the conversation remains classified, but the basic facts became known: that Putin had reached out to Alain seeking some form of moral validation, and that Alain had used that opportunity to make one final plea for peace.
The revelation of the call provided a unique insight into Putin's mindset in those final hours before the invasion. It suggested that even at the last moment there had been doubt, uncertainty, and perhaps a recognition that the path he was choosing would have devastating consequences. But it also revealed the limits of moral persuasion when confronted with political ambition and the momentum of institutional power. Intelligence analysts who later studied the timeline noted several significant details about the timing and nature of the call. Putin had made the decision to contact Alain personally, without going through diplomatic channels or official intermediaries. This suggested that the conversation was deeply personal rather than strategic, indicating that Putin was seeking moral validation for his actions rather than political support. The choice to call Alain specifically was also revealing. Among all the cultural figures Putin could have contacted, he chose someone who represented European artistic achievement, but who also had a reputation for moral independence and intellectual honesty. Putin seemed to understand that Alain would not simply offer supportive words, but would provide an authentic moral perspective on the planned action. The duration of the call, 23 minutes, was significantly longer than most of Putin's conversations with foreign leaders during this period. This suggested that the exchange was substantive and that Putin was genuinely engaging with Alain's arguments, rather than simply going through the motions of consultation. Most significantly, the 10-minute silence represented something unprecedented in Putin's documented conversations. Associates and advisors who had worked with Putin for years noted that he rarely paused for more than a few seconds when making important decisions. The extended period of reflection suggested that Alain's moral arguments had genuinely challenged Putin's certainty about his chosen course of action. During those 10 minutes of silence, according to Alain's later journal entries, the actor could hear background noise from the Kremlin, voices in distant rooms, the sound of footsteps in corridors, the general activity of a government complex preparing for a major operation. This detail, recorded in Alain's private notes, provided confirmation that the call was indeed taking place from Putin's official residence during the final hours before the invasion. When Putin finally responded after the long silence, Alain noted that his voice had a different quality, less certain, more defensive. The confident leader who had begun the call seeking validation had been replaced by someone who seemed to be trying to convince himself as much as his listener. For historians studying the origins of the Ukraine conflict, the Putin-Delon conversation represents a fascinating footnote, a moment when personal relationships and moral authority briefly intersected with geopolitical strategy. It raises questions about whether different words or a different approach might have changed the outcome, or whether the decision had already been made irrevocably. The conversation also revealed the isolation that surrounded Putin in those final hours. While he was surrounded by military advisors, government officials, and intelligence analysts, he chose to seek moral counsel from someone completely outside his political circle. This suggested that Putin understood on some level that his official advisors would only reinforce his existing decisions rather than challenge his moral reasoning. Diplomatic historians had noted that the call represented a unique form of cultural diplomacy, the attempt to use artistic and moral authority to influence political decisions. While such approaches had been tried occasionally throughout history, it was rare for a head of state to initiate such a conversation, and rarer still for the conversation to occur just hours before a major military action.
The psychological dimensions of the call have also attracted scholarly attention. Putin's decision to seek validation from Alain suggested an awareness that his actions would be judged not just politically and militarily, but morally and culturally. The fact that he chose to have this conversation indicated that moral considerations were indeed part of his decision-making process, even if they were ultimately overridden by other factors. Cultural analysts have noted that the conversation represented a collision between two different worldviews, one based on political power and territorial control, the other based on artistic beauty and human dignity. Putin's admiration for European culture, evident throughout his career, created a tension between his political objectives and his cultural values that became apparent during the call with Alain. The aftermath of the call also provided insights into both men's characters. Putin's decision to proceed with the invasion, despite Alain's arguments, revealed the limits of personal relationships when they conflict with institutional momentum and political calculation. Alain's decision to maintain the privacy of the conversation, even as the war unfolded, demonstrated his belief that personal conversations should remain private, regardless of their historical significance. The story of that final phone call serves as a reminder that behind even the largest historical events are human beings making moral choices, and that sometimes the most important conversations in history take place not in government buildings or military headquarters, but between individuals who are trying to understand the right thing to do. If this incredible story of a secret conversation that could have changed history moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of moral courage to influence even the most powerful people. And tell us in the comments, do you think personal appeals can change the course of history, or are some decisions beyond the reach of individual conscience? Because sometimes the most important moments occur in conversations that the world never hears.